We didn't start this war, but under President Trump, we are finishing it. That was the U.S. Secretary for War, explaining what America aims to achieve with its massive military attack on Iran. Meanwhile, Iran has launched a series of counterattacks on its neighbors across the region, and the British government's response to this conflict has shifted in a pretty big way. We'll break down what all of it means on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and for this entire week, we'll be joined by a friend of the podcast from Panorama. It's Jane Corbin. Hello again, Jane. Hello. And Lise Doucet is here. Hello, Lise. It's good to join you, Adam. And good to see you again, Jane. And you as well, Lise. Now, before we get to the analysis, which I know from you two will be excellent, let's talk about a little slice of life from covering this war. Jane, right before we started recording, your phone just started blaring. Could you just explain what that was? That's the Israeli rocket siren, the device that tells you when rockets are incoming, and it's been going off non-stop since Saturday. And yeah, it goes off constantly. Normally I keep it on silent, but for some reason, it broke through, and it tells you where they're coming from, how many are coming, and, roughly what area. And the numbers are just extraordinary. And that's obviously referring to rockets and missiles, but also to drones, which the app calls hostile aircraft. And is that just on your phone from previous trips there? Or do you have it as a kind of journalistic tool? It's both. Sometimes when it gets to be too much, especially at night, I'll obviously turn it off. But there's been so much happening in Israel that it's important to know and to try and keep tabs on it. Well, that really brings the BBC slogan, "Live the Story," to a whole new level. Yeah, you keep yours on. No, I did on my last trip, but then I turned it off. But it is amazing because it reminds you, especially when a big one comes through. Yeah. And Lace, speaking of living the story, I think this is the first time I've seen you face to face since you were actually in Iran 2 weeks ago. So how does that work in your mind? You're covering this military action now, but thinking back to being on the ground there so recently? Well, on a personal level, some of the people I met and worked with there are immediately on my mind. And it makes you think, whatever you report, that these are real individuals, journalists that I know. So you're just wondering, how are you? Are you safe? And did you get the message on your phone from the Revolutionary Guards warning people not to go out on the streets? And so, it's all much more vivid in your mind. So I came back, and I think I have a much better understanding of the mood in Iran. It's very much a country at a crossroads, and of course, we're seeing this in the reaction to the Supreme Leader's death. There are those who revere him as a religious leader. They've been in the streets with these outpourings of emotion, but there are also many who revile him and have been taking to the streets to celebrate. Mostly in the dead of night where they feel safer. And there have been celebrations here in London as well, within the Iranian communities, and we can talk a bit more about that in just a second. But Jane, this is the kind of moment where you want a big atlas open in front of you to point to all of Iran's neighbors, because the major theme of the last 36 to 48 hours has been Iran's counterattacks striking them. Yeah. And everyone was saying before that this risked a regional war. And it's amazing how quickly we've arrived at that point. They've hit, I think, 8 different countries, and obviously Cyprus as well, a British base in Cyprus. So all of those countries and all of those leaders are being drawn in, whether they like it or not, and they're pretty angry about it. They're outraged that even though they took no part in the strikes carried out by Israel and America, they were nevertheless hit back in kind so quickly. And I think Bahrain was hit especially hard at the beginning. We've obviously seen what's happened in Dubai, where a lot of British people live and vacation, and right across the region, in Iraq, in Erbil, in Saudi. All of those countries have been hit by Iranian missiles. And it's so interesting on social media, where you can see videos of gleaming skyscrapers on fire that are clearly AI-generated and obviously fake, but then the very next video you see is real. Oh, it shows these places are actually genuinely being hit. This is a moment not just for Iran, but for the entire region. It's a true before and after moment. Iran has now been changed forever. So has the region, particularly the wealthy Gulf monarchies, whose entire political, economic, and security model is based on the perception of being a safe haven. They're a safe harbor from the kind of tensions and turmoil that have racked the rest of the Middle East. The message is, so come spend your dollars here, invest here, come and be a tourist. Now, you can just imagine, I certainly can, that when this is all over, you'll see big billboards on the subway that just say, "Come back. Please, come back." And you know, once your image is shattered, it takes time. It will come back, in time. But what has also been shattered is the diplomacy and the new relationships that Iran had built up with Arab leaders. And they had been at daggers drawn for decades. But, in recent years, Arab leaders have been realizing that regional issues need regional solutions. And while Qatar and Oman have always had relations with the Iranian leadership, the Saudis and the Emiratis were also coming around. But whenever there was a crisis, the foreign minister of Iran could actually pick up the telephone and call all of those Arab capitals. And those leaders had been working around the clock, either on the telephone to President Trump or racing to Washington to say, I don't embark on another destructive war. The consequences will be huge. And now those same leaders are turning their fire against Tehran and saying, "Why are you hitting us?" So much is literally burning in this moment. And it's burning for those countries which are the source of so much of the world's energy. Gas plants have been hit in Qatar, and oil refining has been hit in Saudi, which is an incredible shock to the system for them, but also for all of us. Because the Strait of Hormuz, that very strategic waterway through which vast quantities of both gas and oil flow, is effectively closed, and the shock that's being felt in those energy-producing countries, that this could have happened, that Iran could have done this, is really unprecedented, even as it's interesting to read about all the workarounds these countries are using to try and get their oil and gas out by other means. So maybe the shock to the oil price might not be as dramatic as it might initially appear. No, and I think the shock to the gas price has actually been bigger than the shock to the oil price, and there will be a way around it. I believe that today, some ships did pass through the Strait of Hormuz, Chinese, for example, and so maybe, as you say, there'll be a workaround, and some will feel it's worth the risk of moving through. But with tanker insurance, no one's going to be able to get it, and no one's going to want to take the risk when you're carrying such precious cargo. And of course, the big issue is that while people can perhaps get through this for a few days, what about if it goes on and on? This is really a measure of that phrase we use in covering conflicts, asymmetric warfare. Jane, of course, has covered many. How do you take on the might of the most powerful army in the world, the United States, and the assets of Israel, on including its staggering intelligence-gathering capabilities? And Iran had warned, as Jane mentioned. I was really taken when I interviewed the Deputy Foreign Minister, Majid Takht Ravanchi, and I said, "If a war is unleashed, will you regard it as existential?" And he said, "Yes." Well, if we do regard it as existential, he said, it would be a different kind of war. And then I pressed him, well, what would happen? What would be so bad? And he said, I don't want to get into what an existential war would look like for us, because it would be a very bad situation, not just for us, but for the entire region. And there, when you have the attack, the first wave of attacks early on Saturday morning, You know, they acted on intelligence and were able to kill not just the supreme leader, the very top cleric, Ayatollah Khamenei, but the top 4 security chiefs, and possibly more as well. President Trump is claiming they've killed 48 leaders, but military and otherwise, all through those different ranks that we've seen. And I think, he's right. It is an existential threat to Iran when you're hitting it at that level and killing so many people at once. But from looking at the coverage around the region, okay, it's scary for those countries. It feels like an act of aggression, but actually, most of the missiles, most of the drones aren't getting through. So, I'm just wondering, has Iran thrown everything they've got at its neighbors, and the threat is actually going to recede from now on? Or, and I realize this is speculation, could there be more to come? Israel has claimed today that it struck underground facilities where ballistic missiles and other missiles are being built. We don't really know, but the general feeling seems to be that this will continue as long as both sides have ammunition to fire. And Iran, as we know, has large stockpiles, not including the Shahed drone, which has been a game-changer in Ukraine and is proving to be so here, with huge waves of these drones already in use, and they reportedly have enormous underground industrial facilities to produce them. So, we can only assume that this situation will persist for days, if not weeks. It's always interesting that you brought up a very important point, which highlights both the strength and weakness not just of journalism, but of eyewitness accounts. If you look online, you might think Dubai is on fire because of the incident at the Palm. I've seen social media messages with people asking, "Why are you guys talking about this instability and the fires in Dubai when the rest of the city is fine," etc.? But in our social media-driven world, people often just see the dominating images and start wondering. Apparently, each one of the big questions people are asking on Google is it safe to go to Dubai? And the Dubai Emirates definitely don't want that question being asked. You can also see a big difference between people who are there, perhaps on holiday or honeymoon or visiting, wanting to leave as soon as possible, and those who've made it their home, who are actually much more relaxed about it. All right, we're recording this episode of Newscast. It's just past 5:20 on Monday afternoon, just before we started. So we heard some comments from Donald Trump at the White House, and Katrina Perry was watching them. Hello, Katrina. Hi, Adam. How are you doing? Please excuse this Mary Poppins moment. I'm holding an umbrella because it just started snowing outside the White House right now. This very moment. Always extreme weather in D.C. So, this was supposed to be a ceremony celebrating military courage, honoring veterans, but it inevitably turned into the first chance to hear directly from Donald Trump about what he actually plans to achieve here. Indeed, it is still a Medal of Honor ceremony, and as I'm speaking, the President is currently presenting those Medals of Honor. They are being awarded posthumously, so it's mostly the sons of deceased veterans who are receiving these medals. But this was President Trump's first public appearance since he authorized those strikes on Iran, which began in the early hours of Saturday morning, specifically 1:15 a.m. here on the East Coast. So, we hadn't seen him in public. We hadn't had a chance for him to answer questions live. As we're recording, I should mention he still hasn't done that, mainly because of the layout of the East Room where this is taking place. The reporters and correspondents are quite a distance from the president, and it's a rather solemn gathering, so, I expect my colleagues will try shouting questions at the president, but I think it's probably unlikely he can even hear them, let alone choose to answer. However, he did address the situation in Iran, which is what many people were eager for him to do. Because there's a feeling here that he hasn't adequately explained the justification for the significant danger he's put members of the U.S. military in at this point. So, and he said he wanted to provide an update on Operation Epic Fury, as they're calling it. He stated that this large-scale combat operation in Iran was very much still ongoing, and he offered his reasoning for it. He said Iran had ignored warnings from the U.S. following Operation Midnight Hammer last June to halt its nuclear weapons program. Now, he also suggested that, in his view, there was an imminent threat that Iran would soon possess nuclear weapons capable of being launched from Iran and hitting the U.S. He said he felt that would happen very soon. Now, we should point out that his own intelligence agency has previously released information indicating that such a capability is many, many years away. But nevertheless, this is President Trump's stated rationale for his actions. He mentioned that he tried to reach a deal with them through negotiations, but he felt Iran simply wasn't interested. He said he believed a deal was agreed upon, and then they backed out. He thought another deal was reached, and they backed out of that one too. So he felt he was left with only one choice, which was this military campaign. And he mentioned wanting to lay out his objectives, and this really felt like he was speaking directly to an American audience that wants to know what those goals are. He stated a goal to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. And he also wants to annihilate their navy. In fact, he said they'd already sunk 10 of their ships. He repeated that he wants to make sure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. And he also said he wanted to stop the Iranian regime from continuing to arm and fund what he called its terrorist armies across the region, which are those proxy groups you were just talking about. Then he brought up the old deal, saying they backed out, and he realized he just can't make a deal with them. So, that was pretty much his explanation, that he just didn't want a threat to the American people. But will that be enough for those who are against this military action he started? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And Jane, as we were watching this on the monitor outside, you immediately pointed out the very flexible timeline he gave. Yeah, that's right. He mentioned, I've said from the beginning it would be 4 to 5 weeks. But then he added, we're ahead of schedule, which suggests it could last that long, but he might shorten it if he thinks things are going well. And I found that interesting because it gives him some wiggle room, but it doesn't really tell any of us how long this will actually go on. And Lee, talking about the war aims, if you want to call them something that grand, there were 4 of them, right? First, taking out Iran's ballistic missile system. Then, taking out their nuclear weapons program. Also, taking out the Navy. And finally, stopping Iran's proxies and allies from causing chaos in neighboring countries. What were your thoughts on those 4 main goals? It's interesting, and Katrina, if you're still there, I was thinking about what Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of War, as he prefers, said in his comments earlier today. This isn't about regime change, but we have changed the regime. Katrina, what was your take on that statement? Yes, I agree, Lee. And I thought that was a very important line. He said this isn't a regime change war, using that word war, which is already controversial in the States. And this really gets to the heart of the matter. What is President Trump's ultimate goal here, even with those 4 objectives he listed? Because he keeps telling the Iranian people to take their country back, yet he says he doesn't want regime change, it seems more like they're just setting the stage for it. And that's the real challenge. I'm trying to figure out what the actual end goal is. I don't think we're any closer to knowing, based on what the President, Secretary Hegseth, or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said today. And once again, we're looking at a very fluid timeline. Secretary Hegseth said earlier that it could be 2, 4, or 6 weeks. Basically, it's however long the President decides it will be. And, Katrina, I believe they've been warned about this, haven't they? They've gotten advice from inside the security establishment that this won't be easy, that it won't necessarily lead to a change in the regime, and it won't create the right conditions for the people to rise up and take over like President Trump has encouraged them to do. And I believe they're getting this message directly from the CIA and other well-informed sources. But the decision was still made to move forward with this, even though there was no guaranteed exit strategy, not even from their own advisors. And then you have President Trump, who we know in his second term can change his mind overnight. I was just reading something that some of you might have seen as well. He gave a 6-minute interview to the New York Times. And in those 6 minutes, he jumped from regime change to talking with the government to then saying the situation in Venezuela, where military action simply took out President Nicolas Maduro, was the perfect scenario for Iran. So, what are we supposed to think about all that? What is the actual plan? Is it what he laid out in his 8-minute speech? Is it what he said today, where he left out any mention of regime change? Or is he still just thinking out loud about the war's true aim, which, Katrina, must be so concerning for people where you are, especially lawmakers who feel he should have been given their authorization to start a war? Exactly. I mean, you have two separate legal issues here. And there's the legal issue at home, and then there's the whole question of international law. You see, acting preemptively in self-defense isn't even a recognized concept in international law. But back home, both Republicans and Democrats largely agree that Iran poses some kind of threat to the U.S., whether immediate or not, and that action against them is warranted. The big debate, though, is that the president decided to do all of this on his own. The U.S. The Constitution states very clearly that only Congress can declare war, and any such declaration must pass through them. It's simply not a power a president holds alone. Of course, President Trump isn't the first to bypass Congress and act unilaterally, but it's definitely stirring up a lot of tension right now. Members of Congress, understandably, prefer to be included in these discussions. We do know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke with the Gang of Eight, or at least 7 of them, meaning the top leaders from both parties on Capitol Hill, before these strikes happened. But when you hear what Secretary Dan General Dan Caney, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said today, he mentioned they'd been somewhat ready for this operation for 30 days. So clearly, this has been in the works for quite a while. In fact, military insiders say that preparations for a mission like this, which currently involves airstrikes from planes and missile launches from naval ships, would actually have taken months. The president and then the secretary were just talking about engaging with the Iranian Navy at this very moment. However, military experts would tell you that if true regime change is the goal, then a ground operation would also be necessary. And they don't believe the current situation in Iran is ripe for such an undertaking. So there's a lot of confusion, and not just about the official legal basis for what's happened, but more importantly, what's the ultimate goal here? What exactly is the president hoping to achieve with all of this? And Lee, could you just explain how Iran is actually run? And who holds the power there that makes it so incredibly difficult for even half the country, 40 million people, to rise up and create a different kind of nation? Just tell us why that's such a tough challenge. Well, for starters, venturing out into the streets is incredibly risky. People have even received phone messages warning them not to protest, saying if they do, they'll face an iron fist and be branded a collaborator. Even when we were there, during times when security forces anticipated more protests, you'd see the Basij, these volunteer militia on motorcycles, roaring around public squares, staring people down, and it felt truly menacing. And their message was clear: we're watching you. I messaged a friend in Tehran this morning, and he told me, I was stopped 3 times last night coming home at makeshift checkpoints by the elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So people absolutely understand how dangerous it is to step out onto the streets, And it brings up the idea of the Venezuela option. The question is, so can you really just, and I dislike this term, decapitate one leader, and then find a way to work with others in the existing power structure, like in Venezuela with its Chavismo, a radical left-wing philosophy governing the country? Iran, however, is a completely different story. Lately, there's been talk. Could we work with someone? Perhaps with Ali Larijani, the Secretary of the National Security Council, who seems to be taking on a larger role? While he's seen as more pragmatic, a single individual simply cannot dismantle and take over such a deeply layered system, politically, religiously, ideologically, and in terms of security. In Iran, you don't just have the regular armed forces. You also have the elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is an absolutely massive organization. It's an enormous organization, also deeply embedded in the country's economic interests. They run schools, hospitals. They're essentially part of Iran's entire national fabric. There's no way you can say they're just an elite security force. Their sole purpose, when they were founded in 1979, was because the new leaders didn't trust the existing army. They believed parts of the army were still loyal to the Shah. Their specific mission is to preserve and protect the Islamic Republic. And it's widely thought that even though there's now a new three-man leadership council, behind the scenes, especially when it comes to choosing a successor, and the IRGC, as it's known, will play a decisive role because they'll want to ensure they approve who takes charge in this current moment of existential threats. So, it's possible that a new supreme leader could emerge, perhaps someone more aligned with a reformist agenda, while still being a leading cleric, and that for pragmatic reasons, elements within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps might see a way to work with him. And this is because the former supreme leader was known for his hostility toward Israel and the United States, and was deeply suspicious of any contact with the West, particularly the U.S., even as he authorized his own teams to negotiate with them. That's a possibility, but it wouldn't be an easy or swift process. Lisa, I'm going to interrupt you because I just got a message that you were supposed to be live on the news channel about 5 minutes ago. So, I feel I should… Perhaps Jane is… Yes, but let me mention one last thing, and Jane knows this very well. There's a phrase that the revolutionary leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, used in 1988, when he grudgingly agreed to a ceasefire with great bitterness, because he realized it was an existential matter for the survival of the isolated Islamic Republic against Iraq. He had to, and he said, "I drank from a poisoned chalice." Has that moment come again, forcing them to drink from a poisoned chalice? Right now, they are fighting a battle for their survival. Lise, I'm going to let you go. I know there are many demands on your time. So, thank you so much for giving us your time. So good to see you, too. Good to see you. Jane, I was going to say that we know, in that strike on Saturday, one of the key figures killed in the defense sector was the leader of the IRGC, the elite force Lise was talking about. But, we also know that after the 12-day war last June, during the initial strikes on Iran by Israel and America, the Supreme Leader worked very hard to put more layers of people in place who could take over if these top military officials were killed. So, we know that has happened. And we also know, as I've covered in great detail, that when Qasem Soleimani, the great IRGC leader, was killed by a drone in Donald Trump's first term, another leader quickly rose to head the IRGC, even as Trump himself is saying how evil, in his words, they are. So, this didn't affect the way the IRGC operated. And I don't think killing their current leader on Saturday will make a difference, because by now, someone else will be heading that up. And the IRGC has such a vested interest in this network of patronage within the country, in terms of the money they make and their deep involvement with the economy and all of that in society. As Lisa said, it's a very layered thing. And Katrina, can we just talk for a couple of minutes about UK-US relations in all of this? Because initially, Keir Starmer said he'd refuse to give the American military permission to use the bases they have, either in the UK or in British territory abroad like Diego Garcia, a subject of many newscast episodes over the last couple of years. Donald Trump then gave an interview to the Telegraph newspaper on Monday morning, where he basically told Keir Starmer off for doing that. But at almost exactly the same time, Keir Starmer had changed his position and was now saying he would give the go-ahead for the Americans to use British bases, because it was now a matter of self-defense for Britain, as British nationals and allies were being attacked by Iran. What's your take on what all of that adds up to on Monday evening, or at least Monday evening for us in the UK, and Monday lunchtime for you in Washington? It's a very fascinating one, isn't it? See, particularly when you listen to what Sir Keir Starmer said in the House of Commons earlier on Monday. You know, he was basically talking about his weekend and how he had faced the decision of joining the US and Israel in these offensive strikes from the outset, and he had decided against it, saying again in that speech to the House of Commons that he doesn't support what they're doing. He doesn't support regime change by air. He questioned the legal standing, in fact, for what the U.S. is doing here. But he said it had then become apparent, when he looked at the self-defense element, as you say, and a request had come from the U.S. to use UK bases, that he now felt that was in the best interests of the UK and, crucially, of the approximately 300,000 UK citizens, he said, are in the region, and he feels that these bases are needed to help defend those people against Iranian retaliatory attacks. But clearly, not a lot of soul-searching was involved for the Prime Minister over those few days. He was essentially getting a lot of flack for sitting on the fence, right? Yet, after his speech in the House of Commons, he made his position very clear. And it's quite different from what Donald Trump is saying about his stance and the mission's goal. Now, if this conflict really does last 4 to 5 weeks, as President Trump suggested earlier, that's going to lead to some seriously tough talks between Kirst and Donald Trump, along with many other allies who want to support the U.S. but don't quite agree with the initial reasons for all this, at least from what we're seeing. President Trump stated he didn't agree with our choice to avoid the first strikes, but I see it as my job to decide what's best for Britain's national interest. And that's exactly what I did, and I stand by that decision. Katrina, I need to let you go. Oh, as I know, you have many other things demanding your attention, but thanks so much for talking with us today. All right, talk soon. Bye. So, Jamie, what exactly was the whole point of it all? I mean, just picking up on what Karina said, if this goes on for 4 or 5 weeks, we know terrible things happen with civilians being impacted. We've seen it in Israel, in Bamesh, when some 30 people were killed, and most notably in Iran itself, when a school in Minab in the south was hit, causing over 50 school children to die, with the death toll currently at 550 people, according to the Iranian Red Crescent. So we know that missiles will go astray, hitting schools and civilian targets, which makes all these decisions by political leaders incredibly fraught. Because what happens then if a missile from a British or American plane hits a civilian target, like we saw in Iran, where that school being hit caused enormous shock and anger in Iran and throughout the region?